At 11:15 on the morning of April 9th, 1944, the Atlantic looked calm enough to forgive mistakes. Lieutenant Commander George Castleman stood on the bridge of USS Pillsbury, watching a German submarine break the surface barely 700 yards off his starboard bow. 10 months at sea, dozens of depth charge attacks, 0 captures, and now, suddenly, there it was. A U-boat, wounded, exposed, breathing open air like a cornered animal that knew the hunt was over. This was supposed to be the satisfying part, the textbook ending. You find the submarine, you force it up, you finish it. Pillsbury and her sister ships did exactly what the U.S. Navy had trained them to do. Machine guns raked the conning tower, aircraft stitched the water with fire. German sailors scrambled, some fighting, some jumping into the sea. Within minutes, the submarine slipped backward and vanished beneath the Atlantic. Another enemy boat destroyed, another checkmark in the column labeled Success. And yet, something didn't sit right. For nearly 10 minutes, the submarine had floated on the surface. 10 full minutes. In naval combat, that is an eternity. Long enough to light a cigarette. Long enough to make a mistake. Long enough to realize too late that you might have just sunk something far more valuable than a steel hull and a crew. Castleman watched the water close over the spot where the U-boat disappeared. Victory was clear, but it felt thin, like winning a hand by folding too early. The Germans had been ruthless hunters, but they were also walking vaults of information. Codebooks, cipher machines, new weapons whispered about in intelligence briefings but never seen. All of it now resting quietly on the ocean floor, perfectly secure from prying eyes. The irony was sharp. The Navy had done everything right and still managed to lose something priceless. The rules were simple. Find the submarine, destroy it before it destroys you. No one talked about boarding. No one talked about capture. The last time an American warship had seized an enemy vessel at sea, James Madison was president. History had quietly decided that such things no longer happened. But as the Atlantic swallowed the wreckage, a crack appeared in that certainty. 10 minutes had been wasted doing exactly what everyone expected, and in that wasted time, an uncomfortable question surfaced, one that refused to sink. What if, next time, instead of killing the submarine, they tried to take it alive? The logic of the Atlantic War was brutally simple. If you found a submarine, you killed it. If you hesitated, it killed you. That equation had been written in burning oil slicks and sinking hulls since the first months of the war, and by 1944 it was carved into instinct. American destroyer escorts did not chase submarines to negotiate. They hunted them to erase them. Detection was victory. Destruction was survival. There were reasons for that mindset, and none of them were theoretical. German U-boats had sent thousands of merchant sailors to the bottom of the ocean. Entire convoys vanished in a single night. Every surfaced submarine represented torpedoes still in the water and crews still alive to fire them. Lingering was not bravery. Lingering was how ships died. The Navy did not teach boarding actions because the Navy did not expect anyone to survive them. Statistics reinforced the fear. In 1943 alone, German submarines sank hundreds of Allied ships. Escorts were smaller, slower, and lightly armed. Their job was not glory. Their job was to stay alive long enough to keep convoys moving. In that environment, the idea of pulling alongside a wounded U-boat and climbing onto it sounded less like innovation and more like a formal request for a posthumous medal. And yet, buried beneath the wreckage on the ocean floor was something more dangerous than torpedoes. Information. German submarines were floating archives. Inside them were code books that dictated where boats went and when they attacked. Cipher machines that transformed enemy chatter from noise into meaning. New weapons that did not simply explode, but listened, hunting ships by sound alone. The Allies knew these things existed. They had rumors, they had fragments. What they did not have was certainty. Breaking German naval codes had taken years of blood and mathematics. Even partial success came at a cost measured in ships lost before the pattern was understood. A single intact submarine could shorten that suffering dramatically. It could answer questions that intelligence officers were still afraid to ask out loud. But the price of acquiring it was absurdly high. You would have to approach a vessel rigged to self-destruct, crewed by men trained to die before surrendering secrets, and do it in minutes while the ocean tried to swallow everyone involved. There was another problem, quieter but just as damning. The United States Navy had not boarded and captured an enemy warship at sea since 1815. Not since wooden hulls and canvas sails, not since the age of powdered wigs and signal flags. Modern naval warfare had moved on, or so everyone believed. Captain Daniel Gallery did not ignore that history. He understood it. That was precisely why the thought refused to leave him alone. The Navy had optimized itself for destruction. It had become very good at it. Perhaps too good. If everyone followed the same rules, then no one ever discovered anything new. And if the enemy depended on secrecy, then secrecy itself became a weapon worth stealing. The decision was never announced. There were no speeches, no official doctrine changes, just quiet orders and careful preparation. Gallery would not wait for permission that might never come. He would prepare his ships to do something they were never designed to do, not because it was safe, not because it was smart, but because the reward, if it worked, could tilt the entire war. It was a gamble measured not in ships, but in history. Once the idea took shape, reality arrived to ruin the romance of it. Capturing a submarine sounded clever in a briefing room. Out at sea, it sounded like volunteering to climb into a steel coffin that someone else had already wired to explode. There was no manual for this, no precedent, no reassuring sentence that began with, "Last time this worked." The first problem was people. Not rank, not enthusiasm, but suitability. The boarding party could not be large. Too many men would slow everything down. It could not be inexperienced. Panic would be fatal. And it could not be composed of specialists who only understood one system, because a German submarine did not care what an American sailor's job title was. Pipes were pipes. Valves were valves. Either you understood how a ship stayed afloat, or you didn't. Albert David was 41 years old, an age when most sailors were expected to be passing knowledge down, not jumping onto enemy warships. He had spent decades learning engines, pumps, and the quiet logic of steel hulls under pressure. He had never boarded an enemy vessel. Neither had anyone else in the U.S. Navy. That made him overqualified and underprepared at the same time, which turned out to be exactly what the situation demanded. The men chosen to follow him were not heroes from recruiting posters. They were steady, practical sailors. The kind who fixed things that should not have broken, and made decisions without asking permission when water was already coming in. They were told what the mission would require. None of them were told it was safe. Silence, in this case, counted as consent. Training began immediately, and it was as improvised as the mission itself. There were no mock submarines, no specialized equipment, just decks, ropes, and imagination. They practiced climbing onto moving surfaces while ships rolled beneath them. They rehearsed jumping from small boats onto steel hulls slick with seawater, fuel oil, or both. They learned to do it fast because speed was not an advantage here, it was survival. They memorized the layout of German submarines from grainy photographs and technical drawings. Control room, engine spaces, torpedo compartments, places where flooding would kill the boat fastest, places where explosives were likely to be hidden. None of it was familiar. All of it had to be learned well enough to navigate in darkness, under stress, while the clock ran out. That clock was unforgiving. From the moment a U-boat surfaced under attack, its crew began destroying it. Sea valves were opened to let the ocean in. Demolition charges were armed to make sure the hull never told its secrets. Best estimates gave a boarding party 3 to 5 minutes before the submarine either sank or blew itself apart. That was not a window. That was a crack. The dangers multiplied quickly. German sailors might still be aboard, armed, injured, or desperate. The submarine could lurch, circle, or even dive unexpectedly, taking everyone on deck with it. Inside, water would be rising, pipes ruptured, decks tilted at uncomfortable angles. There would be no clear labels. Everything would be in German, the lights would likely be out, and somewhere in that darkness, timers would be ticking. There was no special gear to solve any of this, no miracle tool. The boarding party carried basic wrenches, flashlights, and sidearms. The rest was muscle memory and judgment. The Navy had built ships to kill submarines efficiently. It had not built anything to save one. Rehearsals continued day after day, not because they improved morale, but because repetition was the only defense against hesitation. Everyone understood that failure would not look dramatic. There would be no heroic last stand. There would simply be water, pressure, and silence. And if they succeeded, there would be no celebration either. The prize would be secrecy, the kind that demanded no one ever speak about what they had done. They were not preparing for a battle. They were preparing for an anomaly, a moment that should not exist in modern naval warfare. And yet, somewhere ahead, in the vastness of the Atlantic, a submarine would eventually surface. When it did, there would be no time left to debate whether this plan made sense. They would either make history or disappear with it. The contact came without ceremony. A single report from sonar, precise and unemotional, cutting through routine like a knife. Bearing, range, closing. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, a German submarine was moving fast and shallow, confident enough to approach what it believed was another convoy escort. It had no idea it had wandered into something very different. Orders snapped across bridges, engines surged, aircraft peeled away from their patrol patterns and dropped toward the sea. This was the moment everyone had trained for and no one had ever experienced. The task group moved with unusual restraint. Depth charges were set carefully, patterns tight but deliberate. Enough to hurt, enough to force the submarine up, not enough to kill it. That restraint felt unnatural, like pulling a punch in the middle of a fight, and every instinct screamed that it was a mistake. The ocean answered with violence. Columns of water erupted as charges detonated below. Oil surfaced in spreading stains. The submarine was hit hard. 6 minutes later, its hull broke the surface, bow first. Gray steel pouring seawater like a wounded animal bleeding openly. Its rudder was jammed. Its lights were out. It was circling helplessly, unable to dive properly, unable to escape. The plan against all expectations had worked. So far. On deck, chaos exploded. German sailors scrambled through hatches, some running for guns, others throwing their hands up, others leaping straight into the sea. Machine gun fire cracked overhead, precise and relentless, driving anyone still aboard away from the deck. The submarine continued to circle 5 knots, slow but dangerous, a massive, moving obstacle with a mind of its own. This was it. There would be no second chance. The whaleboat hit the water hard. 8 men dropped in, already moving before the boat fully cleared the davits. The coxswain aimed straight for the submarine's path, not alongside it, but inside the turn, gambling on timing instead of safety. The hull grew larger by the second, steel looming over the small boat like a wall. Oil slicked the water. Debris floated past. German sailors thrashed nearby, shouting, waving, pleading. No one looked at them. Mercy would come later, if there was time. The whaleboat slammed alongside. The submarine rolled beneath them, still circling, still sinking by the stern. Albert David grabbed for a railing, his gloves instantly soaked with oil and seawater. The deck was slick, tilted, alive underfoot. One misstep would mean sliding straight back into the ocean, or worse, under the hull. He pulled himself up without hesitation. The others followed, moving fast. Not heroic, just efficient. A body lay near the conning tower, motionless. No one stopped to check. There was no time to be respectful. David reached the hatch and disappeared inside. The interior was nearly dark. Emergency lights cast a dim red glow over unfamiliar machinery, turning pipes and valves into shadows and angles. Water sprayed from ruptured lines. The deck sloped sharply toward the stern. The air smelled of oil, metal, and something sharper. Fear, perhaps. The submarine was dying, and it was doing so loudly. The Germans had done their job well. Sea valves were open. Flooding was already underway. Somewhere deeper in the boat, demolition charges had been armed. Timers were running. The clock that had haunted every training session was now real, and it was not generous. David shouted orders, short and direct. The team split instantly, each man moving toward memorized sections of a boat he had never set foot in before. One found a major flooding point, a large intake pipe left open to let the Atlantic rush in. The cover had been torn away and thrown aside. He located it, wrestled it back into place, and began turning with all the strength he had. The flow slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. It was enough to matter. Elsewhere, hands searched for explosives. 13 charges were found, tucked into compartments designed to be inaccessible under normal conditions. Some were already counting down. Wires were traced by touch in the darkness. Detonators were pulled free. Each one felt heavier than it should have, as if aware of its importance. One mistake here would not wound anyone. It would end everything at once. The submarine lurched violently. Above them, the circling hull created a new danger. Without control, it drifted toward the escort ship that had delivered the boarding party. There was no graceful way out. Steel met steel with a grinding impact that echoed through the compartments. The whaleboat was crushed instantly, splintered and gone. On the escort ship, compartments flooded. Damage reports piled up. The boarding party did not stop. Water continued to rise. The stern was already submerged. Pumps groaned uselessly. Every minute gained felt borrowed. David moved through the control room, slipping in oil and water, shouting to be heard over the roar of flooding. His men worked blindly, soaked to the skin, fingers numb, minds locked on simple tasks. Close that, pull this, move. Do not think about the fact that the submarine was still moving, still unstable, still rigged to explode. Then slowly something changed. The deck stopped tilting further. The water level, which had been creeping upward relentlessly, hesitated. Pumps that had been overwhelmed began to gain ground. The submarine was no longer winning its fight against gravity. It was losing, not by much, not safely, but losing. A second boarding party arrived, forcing their way into the same chaos, adding hands where minutes before there had been none. The work continued without pause. Valves were identified, leaks isolated, systems traced by instinct and experience rather than diagrams. The men worked not as conquerors, but as mechanics racing a flood. At last, the realization settled in, quietly and almost unnoticed. The submarine was no longer sinking. It was still wounded, still dangerous, still foreign and hostile, but it was alive. Against training, against doctrine, against common sense, the impossible had happened. An enemy warship had been boarded, seized, and saved in the middle of the Atlantic. No one cheered. There was no space for it. Exhaustion replaced adrenaline. The men leaned against bulkheads, breathing hard, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a German submarine that was no longer dying. Above them, the ocean rolled on, indifferent to the fact that history had just been forced slightly off course. If they had been 30 seconds slower, none of it would have mattered. The Atlantic would have taken everything, as it usually did. Instead, the submarine remained afloat, its secrets intact, waiting to be discovered. The gamble had paid off. But the price had not yet been tallied. Once the submarine was stable enough to stop fighting the ocean, the nature of the mission changed. The danger did not disappear, but it became quieter, more deliberate. The chaos of survival gave way to something colder. Extraction. What lay inside the steel hull mattered far more than the hull itself. The first discoveries were almost disappointingly ordinary. Stacks of books, folders, charts pinned to bulkheads. Paper does not look like power when you find it wet and oil-stained on a sinking submarine. But this paper carried routes, call signs, patrol zones, and schedules. It told a story of where German submarines had been, where they were going, and where they intended to strike next. For Allied planners, this was not intelligence, it was a confession. Then came the machines. Enigma cipher devices intact, complete with rotors and settings. The Germans trusted these machines the way sailors trust the sea, believing them vast enough to hide secrets forever. Allied codebreakers had been wrestling with Enigma for years, breaking fragments, losing ground, breaking it again. The machine itself was only part of the puzzle. What they needed were the daily keys, the procedures, the habits of the men who used it. Those answers were now sitting quietly on a captured submarine, waiting to be handed over. The hull grew heavier by the hour. Operational orders, signal logs, navigation charts that mapped the invisible war beneath the waves. Nearly 1,000 pounds of classified material was pulled from compartments that, hours earlier, had been filling with seawater. Each document made the capture more dangerous in retrospect. If the Germans realized what had been taken, they would change everything overnight. But the most unsettling discovery came from the torpedo room. 2 sleek weapons unlike anything Allied crews had faced before. Acoustic homing torpedoes. They did not race blindly toward a target. They listened. They followed sound, locking onto the cavitation noise of propellers, hunting escorts that thought they were safe once a torpedo missed. These weapons had already claimed ships and lives. Now, for the first time, Allied engineers could see how they worked, instead of guessing while ships burned. Understanding them was the key to defeating them. Within months, countermeasures appeared. Noise-making decoys towed behind ships, louder than the ships themselves. Torpedoes that obediently chased false targets while their intended victims slipped away. It was not glamorous. It did not make headlines. But it saved lives quietly, the way the best solutions often do. All of it depended on silence. The captured submarine could not become a story. Not yet. Radio transmissions were forbidden. Logs were altered. Prisoners were isolated and told nothing. To the outside world, the U-boat had simply vanished. One more entry in a long list of losses. Families in Germany were told their sons were missing, presumed dead. It was cruel, and it was necessary. If even a whisper reached Berlin, the codes would change, the books would burn, and the greatest prize of the Atlantic War would evaporate overnight. The timing could not have been more unforgiving. Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of Normandy. D-Day hung on coordination, surprise, and speed. Knowing where German submarines were positioned, which routes were dangerous, and which waters were clear, meant convoys arrived intact instead of in pieces. The capture did not win the war on its own, but it tilted the board at the exact moment when balance mattered most. This was the part no one would celebrate. No dramatic footage, no triumphant headlines, just analysts reading intercepted messages that suddenly made sense. Convoy commanders altering courses with confidence instead of hope. Hunter-killer groups arriving at the right place at the right time, again and again. The Atlantic, once a killing ground, became a controlled space. The irony was almost uncomfortable. The most valuable weapon recovered from the submarine was not a torpedo, a gun, or a machine. It was knowledge. The kind that works slowly, invisibly, and relentlessly. Steel sinks. Information spreads. By choosing not to destroy one enemy submarine, the Allies weakened an entire fleet. And the Germans, unaware that anything extraordinary had occurred, continued transmitting, continued sailing, continued trusting a system that had already betrayed them. The ocean kept its silence, and the war quietly shifted direction. When the war moved on, the submarine did not. She was towed quietly, repainted quietly, renamed quietly, and hidden in plain sight. For months, she existed in a strange limbo, no longer an enemy, not yet a trophy, and certainly not something anyone was allowed to talk about. To the outside world, she had simply vanished, like so many others. Silence did the rest of the work. The men who boarded her returned to duty as if nothing unusual had happened. There were no parades, no newspaper stories. Some received medals in ceremonies that avoided specifics, praising courage without explaining why it mattered. Others went back to fixing engines, standing watches, and doing the small, unglamorous tasks that keep wars running. If history had blinked, it might have missed them entirely. The submarine herself outlived the secrecy. After the war, when silence was no longer a weapon, she reappeared in an unexpected role. Not as a threat, but as an object people could touch, walk through, measure with their own footsteps. A German war machine became a museum exhibit, frozen in time, stripped of danger, yet heavy with meaning. Millions would eventually pass through her compartments, standing where water once rose and timers once ticked down toward disaster. Most visitors never think about how unlikely her survival was. Steel does not usually get second chances in war. Ships are designed to sink decisively, taking stories with them. This one did not, largely because a handful of people decided, in a moment of doubt, to do something unnecessary, unapproved, and wildly impractical. The men at the center of the story did not become legends. Some died young. Others lived long enough to watch the world forget the details. The ship that carried them into danger was eventually scrapped, its metal recycled into something unrecognizable. No monument marks her service. History kept the submarine and discarded the escort that made her capture possible. It is an unfair arrangement, but war is not known for symmetry. What remains is not the steel or the metals, but the lesson. The most decisive moments do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they look like hesitation, like wasted minutes, like a question asked too late and answered just in time. The Atlantic War was shaped by firepower, numbers, and industry, but it also turned on a quieter decision. one that favored risk over routine, curiosity over habit, and capture over destruction. History, it turns out, does not always change because someone pulled a trigger. Sometimes it changes because someone dared to stop and ask, what if we don't?